grew up in New Zealand, went to university in Wellington. At law school, I frankly didn't work hard enough to get picked up by any of the large firms. I ended up working for LexisNexis, doing quite an interesting job. And I then was very fortunate to get a job working for AJ Park in Auckland and worked there for 2.5 years. And then it was time to move to the UK when I realised all my friends from high school and university were in the UK. And so moved over in March 2004 and worked in-house in the UK, basically because I needed a job and needed some money, and I wasn't particularly strategic about what I did. And it was good work and I enjoyed it, but I think I realised that I didn't love it enough, and I probably wasn't good enough either to have my boss's job. And I'm still in touch with my boss. I've placed lawyers with him before, but I just didn't want to do it. And then in a weak moment, I was speaking to a recruiter who was another Kiwi actually, and he said, "Oh, you should come and work for me." And so here we are. I mean, 16 years later, it's been a long time. It's been absolutely crazy since about November 2020. So everybody's in lockdown and law firms stopped recruiting from April. It was just a really hard stop, and we had to furlough a few people, and we let a couple of people go in my business. But then they started recruiting at volume, and law firms had been recruiting, particularly in transactional areas. It's a market like I've never seen before for the past 18 months. It's maybe starting to slow down a tiny bit now, but it's still pretty crazy. And by transactional areas, I mean primarily all sorts of finance, corporate, but frankly, they're recruiting in all areas, all types of litigation. I recently placed a patent litigator recently, real estate litigation, insurance. There's just a lot of activity in all areas. Even the counter-cyclical ones, things like employment, are starting to come through. And I wonder if that's because some businesses will have been so busy they haven't made the difficult employment decisions yet, but they might be starting to do it now, as things like the increased cost of everything comes through, and the war in Ukraine is affecting margins and so on. But it's still a crazy busy market. Why would people come to the UK? Apart from the money, and the money is especially driven by private practice. The money is crazy at the moment. There are newly qualified lawyers, which means somebody's come out of university and done a legal practice course and then a 2-year training contract. So they're probably 25, 26, and there are newly qualified lawyers in the city earning £160,000. And it's just silly, and that flows down to the firms below the really top one, because everyone's competing for the same talent. So the money's a big reason why you come over here, but you're in London, which, despite having left the EU, which don't get me started on that, we're still very much the centre of where things are. I talk to employers over here about why New Zealand lawyers would come to London, and I say from a life point of view, from New Zealand, if you're lucky, you might go to Australia once a year, and that's a 3 or 4 hour trip. And from London, if you travel 3 or 4 hours, you'll reach 20 different countries speaking 50 different languages. It's just a place where it's a significantly more diverse centre than New Zealand is, and that's attractive. It's just wonderful to be able to travel so easily. And London itself is tremendously diverse compared to New Zealand or Australia. I should talk about the work, shouldn't I? I mean, the work is so much bigger and so much more specific than what you do in New Zealand. So fairly often I speak with a New Zealand finance lawyer, and even big firms in New Zealand although your experience might lend itself towards perhaps a little bit of real estate finance, that might be half of what you do. And there might be a team in New Zealand at a big firm with 5 partners doing quite a broad range of work. And over here, you'll have a team of 5 partners doing a very specific, tiny bit of work with 15, 20 associates beneath them doing the same thing. And that's just one firm. You know, there's far more opportunity to really get involved in the very specific areas that you're interested in. And it's you know, headline grabbing sort of work. You know, if you're acting for if you're working for a large firm here on a big transaction or a big case, if it's litigation, you'll see it in the papers, you know, and it'll make international headlines. What are they looking for? They're looking for, ideally, they like brand recognition, so they like it if you work for they like it more if you work for a large firm, just because they're more familiar with it. I mean, I know because I've met them and I know a bit about the firms in New Zealand, and I've placed plenty of lawyers from, you know, lesser known firms. I know the quality of experience is probably the same at, for the sake of argument, Anderson Lloyd as it might be at Russell McVeigh. You're probably still doing really good quality work and getting good training and good experience, but it doesn't have the same brand cachet. And it's my job partly to educate the firm a little bit about how small the New Zealand market is and how actually the caliber of people doing the work is still going to be good at a firm just because they haven't heard of it. In terms of right to work, big law firms have never had a problem sponsoring, and they still don't. Kind of the smaller you go, the further kind of down the chain in terms of size that you go, the less likely they are to want to sponsor you, because it is a cost. I mean, if you're generating 300,000 worth of revenue for a firm, 5,000 the cost of sponsorship, whatever it is a drop in the bucket. But if you're generating, you know, 200,000, it's a bigger drop. And in terms of, I guess in terms of their thinking, they'd rather not sponsor if they don't have to, the smaller firms. But the large firms that have hired Kiwi and Aussie lawyers forever don't have a problem with it at all. What often happens is New Zealand lawyers come over on a 2-year visa, and if you're on a 2-year visa, you sort of can't, by definition, take a permanent job because you don't have the right to work permanently. What firms would do is either sponsor you from the start or hire you on a contract until the end of your visa, or until it's a bit of a combination of, if you join a firm and they've hired you on a contract for 2 years and you start making noises about how they, you know, you really want to be sponsored, hopefully you will have done enough to convince them that you're worth sponsoring. But it can be a little bit of a, not a game so much, but just something to keep in mind. I mean, if you're working for a firm and you know that your right to work is running out, they're going to need to start making some movements towards sponsoring you, because otherwise you're going to need to find a job elsewhere that will sponsor you. COVID's kind of last year's or even the year before that's news. What's been really good about the pandemic is that law firms and companies have realized that they don't need to be able to see you in the office to know that you're working. And most firms have are working in a hybrid fashion, so 2 to 3 days a week in the office and the rest from home. It always depends, of course, on the specific partners you're working for and how much they've bought into it. But I've certainly never heard of anybody who's joined a firm and been promised hybrid working, and actually they find out they have to be in the office. It's definitely most people working from home at least 50% of the time. It can vary. I guess it's affected by most lawyers in London are on 3 months' notice, so that affects the speed at which firms recruit. And I mean I know it's frustrating for me, right? And I'm in the middle of it, and I can see what's happening. And I have worked, as part of my career, I have worked as head of recruitment for a law firm. So I know, I was about to say, I know why it takes so long. It's unjustifiable. I don't think it should take as long as it does, but it just does take quite a long time. And I know it's frustrating for candidates and it's frustrating for me. But firms can move quite quickly when there's some pressure on them. And, the best kind of pressure is that the candidate's in a process somewhere else or they've got an offer somewhere else. But it's particularly, I suppose, frustrating that because firms in London expect the people they're hiring most likely to be in a permanent job already, they have to be sort of woken up to the fact that the candidate's coming over from the other side of the world and they've arrived and they've got no source of income, so they need to work, they need a job. And that means things need to be quicker for the candidate than the firm's kind of expecting. But in terms of an answer, there's no sort of guarantee. I mean, if you're, and I have different conversations with different candidates about it, and the advice slightly varies. If you're working for a large firm in New Zealand and you've got the right level of experience and you're working in the right sort of area, whatever's popular, there's no reason why you couldn't get a job before you leave New Zealand. If you are working for a firm that has less brand recognition, or you're working in a practice area that's less in demand, you might need to come over and I guess hustle, for want of a better word. I mean, that's certainly what I had to do when I came over. And it's a bit of a leap of faith, right? Because you're flying across the world with nothing, and you're sort of hoping that your friends don't kick you off the sofa before you find enough money to rent a flat of your own. But it's I don't think I can remember any New Zealand lawyer who's come over and things haven't eventually worked out for. One thing I should say that I didn't mention is the contracting market is much bigger here than in New Zealand. And if you're on a 2-year visa, that's your go-to, because you don't have the right to work permanently. And it's much bigger, and it's a combination of, classic would be a maternity cover or something where you're covering for somebody on maternity leave. But there's also plenty of, I guess you call it, project-based work, where law firms or companies know they've got a busy period and they need somebody in for a month or a few weeks or 2 months or whatever it is. They quite often extend. Certainly my own career, I started out, my first job was a contract and I got made permanent after 6 months, and I got made redundant from that. And then my second job was a contract and they wanted to make me permanent, but I moved to another employer and they started as a contract and it became permanent. It's not unusual to start on a contract, and you're attractive to an employer because you're immediately available for a contract, and New Zealand lawyers tend to be pretty good. So that's why once they figure out, oh, they are actually quite good, we'll make them permanent. That's how it tends to work. There are proper contract jobs that will never become permanent, but there are, if you're looking for a permanent job and you're immediately available, you shouldn't be scared of taking a contract just because it's a contract.